Oh, it seems comfortable, I guess. No, he wore a coonskin, didn't he?
That's right.
Hey folks, we've got some juicy gossip for you today. So, you know The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, right? That iconic late-night talk show that set the standard for all the talk shows we love. Well, turns out Johnny Carson might not have been the squeaky clean guy we all thought. Joan Rivers, rest her soul, seemingly spilled the tea before she left us, claiming that Johnny had his fair share of issues, both in his jokes and personal life. Apparently, he wasn't as perfect as he seemed. 4 failed marriages and some serious beef with certain guests were supposedly part of the Carson drama. And get this, he wasn't shy about cracking jokes at other celebrities' expense. Curious to know all the details? Stick around as we dive into the controversy.
Miss Joan Rivers. The author spot. The book spot. The author spot. How are you?
Okay, check this out. Joan Rivers used to guest host The Tonight Show, right? But things got seriously messy between her and Johnny Carson. Apparently, they had this ongoing beef because Johnny felt snubbed when she ditched his show for her own gig. He was pretty ticked off, thinking she was being disloyal since they were basically going head-to-head in the TV world. Joan's show was on Fox and went toe-to-toe with Carson's during the 1986-1987 season. But even with all that competition, her show got the boot later on. And get this, she claimed that after she went solo, Carson didn't utter a word to her again. But wait, there's more scandal. Joan spilled in her book that they supposedly had a fling while she was still married to Edgar Rosenberg. Now, Joan and Edgar were married for a solid 22 years. But turns out, fidelity might not have been their strong suit. Makes you wonder if Johnny banning her from his show was more about their affair than just loyalty issues to his show. To add to the drama, Edgar tragically took his own life, hitting Joan and their daughter Melissa hard. And guess what? Some folks are saying this heartbreaking tragedy probably pushed Joan to spill the beans on Carson before she left us. Now let's get into the dirt on Carson. Johnny Carson had a knack for throwing around insensitive fat jokes. I mean, fat jokes aren't a new thing, but Carson was all about putting someone's weight on blast for millions to see on national TV. Imagine being on the receiving end of that, right? So, veteran NBC actor Raymond Burr was Carson's go-to for fat jokes. But here's the kicker. Burr had enough of Carson's fat shaming and straight up refused to show up on The Tonight Show. Well, almost. He did make a couple of appearances in '68 and '76, but you can bet there was some serious tension in the air. Another guest who reportedly had a tough time dealing with Johnny was none other than Bob Hope. Bob Hope used to be a regular on Johnny Carson's show, but as the years rolled on, Hope's hearing and eyesight weren't holding up too well. And let me tell you, it became a bit of a struggle for him during his guest appearances on Carson's show, kinda ticking Carson off. Hope had a hard time catching Carson's questions, testing the man's patience. Carson had to stick to his script like glue. If he dared to throw a question out of order, Hope might end up answering something completely different. Despite the annoyance, Hope kept showing up, flaunting his struggles on national TV. One of the writers even spills the beans on how Carson once got seriously frustrated after a show with Hope, saying to his writer, "If I ever end up like that, guys, I want you to shoot me." Besides Joan Rivers, Johnny also allegedly hated another colleague of his, Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder was the Tomorrow Show host whose show followed Carson's show on NBC. Carson thought of him as a no-talent bore. Snyder gained national fame as the host of Tomorrow with Tom Snyder, more commonly known as The Tomorrow Show, until it ended. He was later offered a new show, The Late Late Show with Tom Snyder. One night, while he was out for drinks in the late '70s at the popular LA eatery Chasen's, Carson became irate and violent. He went on a tirade about how much he hated Snyder. Obviously, a public alcohol-induced tirade is not professional at all. But it doesn't end there. As a late-night talk show host, Carson had many guests. He also had his favorites and least favorites. Can you guess which guest he thought was the worst to have on his show? From Carson's point of view, Bob Hope was not a good guest. Bob Hope, another American television icon, came armed with scripted jokes. Carson criticized the fact that Hope rarely would engage in any genuine conversation. Carson's former co-head writer, Andrew Nichols, said, "There was nothing spontaneous about Hope. He was a guy who relied on his writers for every topic. Johnny was very quick on his feet, very well read. He was a guy who learned Swahili, learned Russian, learned astronomy. He appreciated people who he felt engaged with the real world. There was nothing to talk to Bob about." Hold up, it gets darker. So, there have been rumors flying around for ages that Johnny Carson was supposedly involved in some not-so-great behavior, harassing women on his show and even guests during his super-long stint on The Tonight Show. Weirdly enough, no lawsuits ever went down, and they're saying it's partly because of the era the show was in, and of course Johnny having some top-notch lawyers. Now that Johnny's no longer around, it's pretty unlikely we'll see any payback or legal drama. But get this! Some former Former guests like Joan Rivers are supposedly starting to spill the beans about their not-so-great encounters with Johnny. Who knows? Maybe more juicy stories will come out as the stars get older and start dishing it all out in their memoirs. Despite being a TV legend, turns out he wasn't exactly a saint. Dude had a reputation for treating people pretty poorly. Now, you'd think when someone ties the knot, it's all rainbows and butterflies, right? Not in Carson's world. One of his cringe-worthy moments happened during his honeymoon with his fourth wife, Alexis Moss. Picture this: Italy, yacht trip, and Carson decides to publicly embarrass Alexis. So, in 1987, Johnny Carson and his fourth wife, Alexis Moss, jetted off to Italy for their honeymoon on a fancy yacht. But here's where it gets real. Carson's mood took a nosedive, and he decided to drop a bomb on his new wife. In front of others, he goes, "We've been married for 3 weeks. If you say something like that again, this marriage won't last another 3 weeks." Talk about honeymoon vibes gone wrong. Also, Johnny Carson had 3 sons from his first marriage, but here's the twist: he didn't have any more kids with his other 3 wives. Now, his son Rick had a rough go, dealing with mental health struggles. Back in the day, mental health wasn't really talked about, you know? Things got pretty intense. Rick ended up in a mental hospital. And get this, Johnny, his own dad, straight up refused to visit. Crazy, right? According to Johnny's former manager and agent, Henry Bushkin spilled the beans on that. There was an event that happened prior to Rick ending up in a mental health hospital, so Johnny Carson is a guy who loved his drinks, also had a bit of a nasty attitude to go with it. Flashback to October 1987, NBC throws him this fancy 25th anniversary bash on the Queen Mary. It's a big deal, right? But guess what? Carson's son Rick, who had his own set of issues, is there and totally wasted. Johnny decides to check on him, and bam, they end up in a massive screaming match on a ship filled with big shot network folks, media, and Carson's family and buddies. Witnesses spill the tea that Carson was the one going off the rails, lost his cool, started yelling, and get this, he even pulled back his fist like he was going to throw down with his own son. Luckily, someone stepped in and prevented a full-blown family brawl. Unfortunately, his story doesn't have a happy ending. On June 21st, 1991, Rick was driving his vehicle near the scenic coastal town of Morro Bay, California, when it plummeted 125 feet down an embankment. He died instantly. Johnny paid tribute to his son on his show, but it didn't change the fact that their relationship was strained. There are rumors that whenever he was hitting the bottle, Johnny Carson's not-so-great side tended to come out, and honestly, that was pretty often. A lot of folks who crossed paths with him remember him as a bit of a mean dude. In 1982, Carson gets caught behind the wheel of his DeLorean, a bit too buzzed for comfort. Ended up pleading no contest to a misdemeanor charge, and his punishment? 3 years probation. As part of the deal, he had to go through some alcohol program for drivers, and get this, he could only use his car to commute to work and back. No passengers, no furry friends in the car. It's like they put his wheels on lockdown. Carson wasn't in denial when it came to his addiction. He regularly avoided the media and press so he wouldn't have to confront his issues or respond to questions. But he knew he had a problem. It changed his approach to his show and how he joked about addiction. In a 1977 interview with 60 Minutes, Carson admitted there was a time when he used to drink and he didn't handle it well. "I don't handle alcohol well at all, no. Really don't," said Carson. "Oh, Ed McMahon and I have had some wonderful times in the past." Interesting ideology around alcoholism. His more mean-spirited jokes about others didn't go over so well, though. Alright, so back in 1980, Johnny Carson had this mega deal on the table to snag the Aladdin Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. But guess what? He bailed on it, and a rival crew, led by Wayne Newton, swooped in and clinched the deal. Now, normally, this kind of personal finance move wouldn't make headlines, but Carson got ticked off when the media painted it as him losing the deal. So, what does Carson do? He starts cracking jokes on his show about Wayne Newton, the new owner. And here's the kicker. Newton was all about this macho image, right? So, this whole thing turned into a full-blown, high-profile feud between Carson and Newton. Years down the road, Wayne Newton spilled some serious tea on Larry King Live. He straight up called Johnny Carson a mean-spirited dude, claiming Carson had hurt people behind the scenes, and he'd had enough of Johnny directing that negativity his way. He said, "Johnny Carson is a mean-spirited human being, and there are people that he has hurt that people will never know about. And for some reason, at some point, he decided to turn that kind of negative attention toward me, and I refused to have it." Newton wasn't having any of those insults. Finally fed up, Newton took matters into his own hands. He stormed into Carson's office at the studio, basically saying, "Enough is enough. We either stop the jokes or we throw down. And you know what? Carson actually took it seriously and called it quits on the jabs. So back on July 2nd, 1969, Johnny Carson went full-on attack mode on the New York Times after his nightly monologue. Why? Because they ran a piece claiming he was the top-paid TV guy, raking in a cool $75,000 a week. Carson was having none of it. He straight up denied it, calling the article damned unfair. In a follow-up, the Times admitted their reporter goofed, saying that $75,000 a week was probably way off the mark. Okay, imagine this wild scenario. December 1973, Johnny Carson cracks a joke on Tonight about a made-up toilet paper shortage. Now, you'd think it's just a gag, right? But with Carson's massive audience, it turns out people took it way too seriously. Cue panic buying and hoarding of toilet paper all over the United States. And what was the result? Stores got cleaned out and toilet paper makers had to ration supplies, dealing with an actual shortage that dragged on for weeks. Carson had to do some damage control and apologized in January 1974. The New York Times called it a classic study of how rumors can spiral out of control. Even with all the drama swirling around Johnny Carson, let's not forget, he was still the go-to guy for laughs and a top-notch host in his prime. I mean, The Tonight Show had its glory days with previous hosts like Parr, but when Carson took the reins, he really nailed it in the ratings. The guy knew how to keep the audience entertained, controversies aside. Billy Wilder, the filmmaker, had this to say of Carson: "By the simple law of survival, Carson is the best. He enchants the invalids and the insomniacs as well as the people who have to get up at dawn. He is the Valium and the Nembutal of a nation. No matter what kind of dead asses are on the show, he has to make them funny and exciting. He has to be their nurse and their surgeon. He has no conceit. He does his work and he comes prepared. If he's talking to an author, he has read the book. Even his rehearsed routines sound improvised. He's the cream of middle-class elegance, yet he's not a mannequin. He has captivated the American bourgeoisie without ever offending the highbrows, and he has never said anything that wasn't liberal or progressive. Every night, in front of millions of people, he has to do the salto mortale, circus parlance for an aerial somersault performed on the tightrope. What's more, he does it without a net, no rewrites, no retakes. The jokes must work tonight." On May 22, 1992, Johnny Carson, the legend himself, decides to call it quits from showbiz at the ripe age of 66. He bows out as the host of The Tonight Show, and let me tell you, his farewell was a big deal. Major media event, emotions running high for Carson, his buddies, and the audience. They dragged it out over several nights to give the man the send-off he deserved. In a nod to Carson's massive influence, a bunch of networks with their late-night talk shows actually went off the air for the whole hour he did his last show. And after 13 tries, The Tonight Show finally snagged an Emmy for Outstanding Variety, Music, or Comedy Series later that year. That emotional penultimate show with Johnny's final guests, Robin Williams and Bette Midler, probably sealed the deal. Now, NBC hands over the hosting gig to the then permanent guest host, Jay Leno. And boom, that's when the epic Leno versus Letterman late-night battle kicks off on separate networks. The end of an era, but the start of a whole new showdown. So when Johnny Carson wrapped up his final Tonight Show, he kind of hinted that, he might come back with some new gig if he felt like it. But guess what? Instead, he decided to dive headfirst into retirement mode. Dude rarely popped up in interviews, passed on NBC's 75th anniversary shindig, and kept a pretty low profile. Every now and then, he'd make a surprise cameo, like voicing himself on a 1993 episode of The Simpsons, dialing up David Letterman in November 1993 on Late Show with David Letterman, and showing face in the 1993 NBC special Bob Hope, The First 90 Years. Basically, he was living that low-key retired life with the occasional cameo thrown in for good measure. Johnny Carson's show was like the launchpad for tons of performers, especially comedians and musicians. If you were a comedian and got Carson to crack a laugh, plus snagged an invite to the guest chair, that was like the ultimate achievement. It was the dream gig for folks like David Letterman, Freddie Prinze, Robin Williams, Jay Leno, Jerry Seinfeld, Arsenio Hall, Jeff Foxworthy, and Ellen DeGeneres. Basically, if you made it on Carson's show, you were on the map. In '66, Carson even turned Milton Bradley's Twister into a sensation by playing it with actress Eva Gabor. That game was kind of flying under the radar until Carson gave it the spotlight, and suddenly, everyone had to have it. And let's not forget, Carson's show wasn't just for laughs. It followed in the footsteps of The Ed Sullivan Show, showcasing all kinds of talent and keeping that vaudeville-style variety show vibe alive. And comedians like David Letterman, Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien, Dennis Miller, Ellen DeGeneres, Gary Shandling, Steve Martin, Ray Combs, Arsenio Hall, Craig Ferguson, and Jimmy Fallon all tipped their hats to Carson as a major influence. The man was a legend maker, no doubt. On March 19, 1999, Johnny Carson took a hit with a serious heart attack at his crib in Malibu, California. They rushed him to the hospital in Santa Monica, where he went through a quadruple bypass surgery. Now, Carson had been puffing away like a chimney for years, and in his early Tonight Show days, he'd even light up on camera, going through a crazy 4 packs of Pall Mall cigarettes daily. Talk about a heavy habit. Apparently, he'd been telling folks since the 70s that these cigarettes were doing him in. Fast forward to September 2002, Carson spilled the beans that he had emphysema, but brushed off the idea that he was on his deathbed. However, on January 23, 2005, Carson passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, respiratory failure from emphysema taking its toll. They cremated him, handed the ashes to his wife, Alexis Moss, and respecting the family's wishes, there was no big public memorial. Carson's younger brother, Richard, who happened to be an Emmy Award-winning director, survived him. Tributes flooded in upon his death, even getting a shout-out from then-President George W. Bush. Let's be real, though. Carson wasn't exactly a saint in the entertainment world. I mean, show me someone who is. We've heard plenty of alleged dirt on some of our favorite celebs. Now, here's the real talk. Do you think Joan Rivers was onto something with her claims about Johnny? Or is it all just rumor mill buzz? Drop your thoughts in the comments and we'll catch you in the next video.